Hey, my name is Lucas Bennett. I was born and raised in rural Montana, where the winters stretch long and the wind cuts across the prairie like a blade. If you want to survive out here, you learn early how to endure. My family owns Bennett Ridge Ranch, a dairy operation set on the northern slope above the small town of Red Hollow. From a distance, it looks like nothing special. A line of weathered barns, an old wooden house, a few hay sheds, and fences that run all the way to the base of the mountains. But to me, it has always been home. It is the place I learned to ride, to fix a water pump, to milk cows before sunrise, and to read the weather by the smell of the wind and the color of the sky. My father, John Bennett, is a man the whole valley respects. He does not talk much, but if he says he will help you pull a truck out of the mud or haul hay through a blizzard, he will do it. The hands who work for him respect him because he is strict but fair. He knows the name of every cow, every worker, every patch of ground that hides rocks, and every stretch of fence that tends to break after a storm. There is only one name that can shut his face down in an instant: Anthony Walker. The Walkers live on the other side of the southern fence, at Walker Creek Ranch. If you stand on the high ridge, you can see both places clearly, split only by a long run of old barbed wire. To strangers, it is just a property line. To the people of Red Hollow, it is a scar that has lasted 20 years. When I was little, I used to ask my father why I was never allowed to cross it. At 8 years old, I asked, "Dad, what's over there?" He was mending a saddle. His hand stopped for half a second. "Don't ever climb that fence," was all he said. I asked again at 12. "Some things you don't need to know yet." At 16, I pushed harder. "I need to know why you hate them." He looked at me for a long time. There was anger in his eyes, but something heavier underneath it. Pain, regret, a kind of helplessness. "I don't hate people for no reason," he said. "Trust me on that." After that, I stopped asking. Not because the curiosity went away, but because I understood there was a locked room inside my father, and if I forced the door open, he might not be able to stand what came out. My mother Rose died when I was 21. In the months before she passed, I often caught her looking toward the fence the way a person looks at something they miss. Only later did I learn that she and Martha Walker, Anthony's wife, had been best friends since high school. Martha died in the fire 20 years ago. That same fire turned my father and Anthony Walker from men who once called each other brothers into men who could not look each other in the face. People in town tell different versions of what happened. Some say my father betrayed Anthony. Some say Anthony blamed the wrong man. Most agree on only one thing. From the day Martha died in the flames, the two men never shook hands again. On the other side of the fence lived Sarah Walker. I knew of her long before I really met her. We grew up in the same town, passed the same church, the same fall fair, the same little grocery store. But there was always an invisible space between us, left behind by our fathers. I knew she was Anthony's only daughter. She rode well. She had gone to college in Bozeman for agricultural management and come home to help run the place. I had seen her at the local fair once, standing by a stall of honey and dried apples, brown hair tied low, sleeves rolled up, smiling at children who asked to pet the foals. I remember thinking she had a beautiful smile. Then I reminded myself she was a Walker, and I was a Bennett, and those two names were not supposed to stand in the same sentence. One early summer morning, I went to check the pasture near the creek that marks the boundary between the two ranches. Rain the previous days had dropped a few branches across the fence. I wanted to fix it before any cattle wandered through. When I got close, I saw hoof prints in the mud that did not belong to our herd. I followed them and found a broken stretch of wire. Inside our grass, a young heifer with the Walker Creek brand was grazing as if she had simply decided to take a vacation. I sighed. I could have called someone to come get her. I could have left it for my father to handle. But the animal had nothing to do with the hate between grown men. I took a handful of mineral salt from the truck and slowly coaxed her back toward the fence. That was when I heard hoofbeats. A young woman rode up from the Walker Creek side. She swung down the moment she saw the heifer and let out a soft breath of relief. "Thank God. So, this is where you got to." Then she saw me. I saw her at the same time. Sarah Walker. We stood still for a few seconds, only a few strands of wire between us. In my head, I heard my father's voice, the one he had repeated for years. "Never cross that fence." Sarah spoke first. She looked at the heifer, then at me, her voice light but still guarded. "Looks like she decided to go sightseeing." I gave a small laugh. Looks like she prefers this side. She seemed surprised that I had laughed. Maybe she had been taught that Bennetts only knew how to hate. I opened a temporary gap in the broken section and used the salt to guide the heifer through. Sarah held the lead rope and patted the animal's neck. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to help." "If one of ours wandered over to your place," I answered, "I'd hope someone would do the same." She studied me for a long moment. Then she asked a question that stopped me cold. "So, you don't hate me?" I was caught off guard. Then I shook my head. How could I hate someone who's never done anything to me? Something in her eyes softened. This answer seemed to break a rule she had heard her whole life. "Sometimes I think our fathers are still fighting a story the rest of us never even understood," she said. I rested my hands on the top wire. "I think the same thing." We stood in silence. It was not an awkward silence. It felt more like the strange recognition that comes when you meet someone you were supposed to avoid and realize they look nothing like the enemy in the stories you were told. Before she left, Sarah took the remaining salt from my hand to lure a couple of other cows that had drifted close. When she took it, our fingers touched for a fraction of a second. Nothing dramatic happened, but I felt my heart miss a beat, clear and sharp. She climbed back onto her horse. Before she rode away, she turned once more. "Hope the next time we meet isn't because of a runaway cow." "If that's the case," I said, "it'll be better for my fence." She smiled. I watched her until she disappeared behind the cottonwoods. That evening, my father noticed something different in me. During supper, he watched me smile at my plate without realizing it. "Something happened today?" he asked. I shook my head quickly. "No, just a good day." He looked at me longer than usual, then his eyes drifted to the old photograph of my mother on the wall. In that picture, another woman stood beside her, Martha Walker. My father opened his mouth as if he meant to say something, then closed it again. On the other side of the fence, Sarah later told me, Anthony asked her almost the same question that night. He had found her washing dishes and humming under her breath. "Something make you happy today?" She only answered, "Today was a good day." Neither of our fathers knew yet that the fence between the two ranches had already begun to lose its power over two people who had never learned how to hate the way they did. After the day with the runaway heifer, Sarah and I began to meet more often. No one planned it. At least, not at first. I had reasons to check the stretch of fence near the creek. She had reasons to check the cattle on her side. I needed to replace a few posts. She needed to find a colt that had wandered too far. I went to look at the water level. She happened to be looking at the water level too. The meetings never lasted long. We still stood on our own sides of the wire as if refusing to step across the physical line meant we had not yet betrayed our fathers. At the beginning, we kept to safe subjects: weather, hay, the herd, milk prices, the pump that kept failing, the fall fair coming up. But the longer we talked, the farther the conversations drifted. I told her I wanted to expand the small cheese room at Bennett Ridge. I was tired of selling only raw milk to the big distributors who always set the price. I wanted something with our own name on it, something that might give the ranch a little more control over its future. Sarah said she wanted to make Walker Creek more sustainable, plant more apple trees, keep bees, open a program so kids from town could come learn where food actually came from. "I don't want this place to be only dirt and debt," she said. "I want it to have a future." Looking at her across the fence, I understood why her smile stayed with me. Sarah was not only pretty, she had a stubborn kind of hope. The more I saw her, the more the old feud between our families felt like something that no longer made sense. She understood ranch life. She understood loss. She understood the weight of carrying a legacy you never chose but still loved too much to walk away from. One afternoon we stood near the creek and she asked, "Have you ever wondered if our fathers hadn't hated each other?" "Maybe we would have grown up as friends," I answered. "Probably I'd have sneaked over to steal your apple pie." She laughed. "And I would have turned you in." "That cold?" "If it was good pie, of course." We both smiled, but the laughter faded quickly. Behind the joke sat a whole life we were not allowed to have. A life where the two ranches were not split by the pain our parents carried. One day, after a short meeting by the fence, Sarah rode back toward Walker Creek and found old Caleb waiting near the horse barn. Caleb had worked for Anthony more than 30 years. He was one of the few people who still remembered the day of the fire clearly. He took off his hat and said, "Miss Sarah, have you ever asked carefully about the fire from back then?" She stopped. "I only know my mother died that day." Caleb looked toward the fence line. "That fire took more than one life. It took the trust between two good men." "Do you know what really happened?" she asked. He did not answer directly. "I know that when people hurt bad enough, they sometimes remember the truth wrong. Be careful. Some wounds lie quiet for a long time, just waiting for a reason to open again." Then he walked away. Sarah told me about it the next time we met. Standing on my side of the wire, I felt a chill. Until then, the fire had only been the reason two families hated each other. For the first time, I sensed there might be a misunderstanding no one had the courage to dig up. A few days later, Red Hollow held its summer festival, the biggest event of the year. Food stalls, livestock auction, country music, games for children, and an outdoor prayer of thanks for the season. Both the Bennetts and the Walkers attended every year, but they always kept their distance. My father arrived early and stayed near the dairy cattle auction. Anthony arrived early too and stayed on the opposite side of the grounds. The town was used to the sight of two men in the same place who never looked at each other. I saw Sarah near the church booth, helping children paint small clay pots. She saw me as well. Neither of us called the other's name, yet we both drifted closer without thinking. We talked for a few minutes. Ordinary talk that felt dangerously ordinary. She asked if I had brought any cattle to the auction. I asked how her apple project was going. She told me a goat at Walker Creek had eaten the visitor information sign. I said the goat had terrible literary taste. She laughed. When music started from the small stage in the distance, Sarah looked at me and asked, very quietly, "Have you ever been afraid because you liked someone?" I knew what the question meant. I also knew that if I answered truthfully, there would be no easy way back. "I think I'm afraid right now," I said. She lowered her eyes and smiled, just a little. No one said the word love. No one took the other's hand. But in that moment, the feeling between us had already stepped across the fence before our bodies dared to follow. Then I heard my father's voice. "Lucas." I turned. He stood a few steps away, face closed. From the other direction, Anthony Walker was walking toward us. Sarah's face went pale. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The noise of the festival seemed to pull back. My father looked at me, then at Sarah. "I told you never to get into this." "Dad, we were only talking." Anthony's voice cut in, hard as stone. "Home, now." Sarah's hands tightened at her sides. "Dad?" He repeated the single word. "Now." She lowered her head. Before she left, she looked at me once. The look was short, but long enough for me to see the sadness in it. I watched her and her father walk away from the festival, and the weight in my chest settled deeper. On the drive back to Bennett Ridge, my father did not say a word. When we reached the house, I followed him out onto the porch. I could not stay silent any longer. "You have to tell me the real reason. Why do you hate Mr. Walker this much?" He stood with his back to me, hands gripping the brim of his hat. "There are pains you don't understand yet. But that happened before Sarah and I were even old enough to know anything. She isn't to blame." He turned. For the first time, I saw the shine of tears in his eyes. His voice came out rough. "In that fire, I had to choose who to save." I stood frozen. "What do you mean?" He opened his mouth, then stopped when he met my eyes. His face hardened as if he himself was afraid of what might come out next. "This ends here." He went inside and left me alone on the porch. A choice. One person saved, one person not. For the first time in my life, I understood that the feud was not built only on anger. It was built on guilt. That same night, on the other side of the fence, Sarah faced her father. She told me later every word. Anthony called her into the office. He stood by the window looking toward the fence the way he had looked at it for 20 years. "I told you to stay away from the Bennetts," he said. Sarah answered calmly. "I never promised that. You're the one who made a promise to the past." The words stopped him for a moment. She went on. "Lucas is a good man. He isn't responsible for something that happened 20 years ago." Anthony raised his voice for the first time. "You don't know what happened." She looked straight at him. "Then tell me." The question hung in the room. It took him a long time to speak. When he finally did, his voice had dropped. "John Bennett pulled me out of the fire, but he left your mother behind." Sarah could not answer. Anthony continued, though his voice had begun to shake. For 20 years I believed he chose to save me and let Martha die. She asked almost in a whisper, Are you sure? He looked down at the desk. I was sure for 20 years. He was quiet for a long stretch, then added, But now I don't know anymore. That last sentence hurt her more than the accusation. It was not the blame that cut deepest. It was the late, uncertain doubt in her father's voice. None of the four of us slept that night. I lay in my bed at Bennett Ridge thinking of Sarah's eyes at the festival, of my father's unfinished words on the porch, of a fire I had never seen but had lived in the shadow of my whole life. In the end, I got out of bed and knelt beside it. I had not prayed much since my mother died, but that night I did not know what else to do. I spoke very quietly. God, if I'm wrong, change my heart. But if this feeling isn't something bad, don't let my father keep living inside a past he can't escape. I can give Sarah up if I have to, but I can't stand watching him stay locked in that pain any longer. I did not know that on the other side of the fence, Sarah was also on her knees, praying almost the same words. She said, I know my father is a good man. I also believe Lucas's father is a good man. If there's any way to heal this story, please start with their hearts. Don't do it for us, do it for them. No one should have to live as a prisoner of one wound for 20 years. I also did not know that my father was standing outside my door, hearing every word. He had been walking down the hall for a glass of water when he caught my voice. He stopped. When I asked God to heal him, he leaned against the wall and cried without a sound. At Walker Creek, Anthony heard Sarah's prayer the same way. He stood outside her door with one hand on the wall, listening to his daughter ask not for permission to love me, but for her father to be set free from hate. That night was the first time in 20 years both men realized their children were not fighting against them. We were not trying to tear the families apart. We were trying to pull them out of the wound they had carried too long. In the days that followed, something small shifted. My father never mentioned that he had overheard my prayer. Anthony never told Sarah he had heard hers. But neither of them stayed exactly the same. My father no longer hardened at the sound of Walker Creek. Anthony no longer turned away the moment a Bennett Ridge truck passed him in town. The hate was still there, but it no longer sat as comfortably as before. At Walker Creek, Anthony began clearing out the old office to find land papers. In a drawer he had not opened for years, he found a cardboard box sealed with yellowed tape. On the outside, in Martha's handwriting, were the words, letters, and memories. He sat for a long time before he could open it. Inside were old photographs, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and pieces of a time when the two families had still been close. There was a picture of my father and Anthony as young men, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing in front of a newly built horse barn. Beside them stood my mother and Martha, both pregnant, hands resting on their bellies, looking at each other like sisters. At the bottom of the box was a folded piece of paper. The date written on it was the day of the fire. Anthony opened it, read only the first few lines, and had to fold it again because his hands were shaking too hard. Sarah saw him come out of the office with a pale face. Dad, are you all right? I'm fine, he said. But his voice said he was not fine at all. At the same time, Montana moved into a hard drought, nearly 3 months without rain. The grass on the hills turned yellow. The creek ran lower every day. Hot wind blew from morning until night, lifting thin layers of dust against the windows. Every rancher understood that a single spark could turn the whole prairie into hell. My father had the pumps checked. Anthony kept the water trucks full. Both men who had once lost everything to fire could smell the danger in the air. Then it happened. One Tuesday afternoon, with the sun high and a strong wind coming from the west, I was near the cattle barns at Bennett Ridge when I saw a column of black smoke rising behind the trees to the south. At first I thought someone was burning trash. Within minutes, the smoke thickened. The wind pushed it straight toward our dry pasture. A hand shouted, "Fire!" I ran for the truck, heart hammering. The flames had started in the grass right along the fence line, where the dry growth stood knee-high. The wind drove the fire hard toward the secondary barn. Some of the cattle panicked and scattered. A group of them got trapped in an old holding pen near the edge of the trees. My father arrived seconds later. He saw the trapped animals and did not hesitate. He grabbed a rope and ran straight toward the pen. I yelled, "Dad, don't!" He did not stop. "They can't get out on their own." Smoke closed over the area fast. I tried to follow, but two of the hands held me back. Lucas, you can't see a thing in there. I fought them. Let me go. My father's in there. At that moment, the sound of engines came from the Walker Creek side of the fence. Two water trucks from the other ranch came tearing through the red dust. Anthony Walker jumped down before the first truck had fully stopped. I stared at him, not quite believing what I was seeing. The man my father had called an enemy for 2 decades was standing in front of a fire on Bennett Ridge land. He looked at me and asked only one question. "Where's your father?" I pointed into the smoke. "He's trapped in there." Anthony did not say another word. He took the radio, gave orders for the crews from both sides to work together. One truck to hold the north edge of the fire, one to protect the barns, a tractor to cut a fire break, no one going in alone. Then he wet a cloth and tied it over his face. I realized what he meant to do. "You don't have to do that." He looked at me. There was no hate in his eyes, only an old pain being forced to choose differently. "Yes," he said, "I do." Then he ran into the smoke. I stood frozen. I had never imagined I would see that sight. The enemy of my father risking his life to save him. In that moment, there were no Bennetts or Walkers, no fence, no 20 years of hate. There was only fire, smoke, and one last chance for two men not to repeat the tragedy of the past. I stood outside the burning ground, throat raw from smoke and shouting. Hands from both ranches worked side by side, as if no one had ever taught them to avoid each other. Men from Bennett Ridge dragged hoses. Men from Walker Creek drove the tractor cutting a fire break. No one asked which side anyone belonged to. Inside the smoke, my father had managed to open the gate and free most of the trapped cattle, but a burning tree trunk crashed down behind him and blocked the way back. Later, he told me he could barely see. The smoke burned his eyes and the heat pressed against his skin like a living thing. He searched for an opening, but fire closed in from every direction. Then he heard a familiar voice call his name. "John!" He froze, certain he had imagined it. "Anthony?" Anthony appeared through the gray, a wet cloth over the lower half of his face, eyes red from the sting. The two men looked at each other for only a few seconds. 20 years of distance disappeared in a moment too heavy for blame. Anthony grabbed my father's arm. "We're getting out of here first." My father, stubborn even then, still asked, "Are you crazy? Why did you come in?" Anthony pulled him forward. "If I wanted a polite conversation, I would have waited until the smoke cleared." While they searched for a way out, another burning branch fell and sealed the main path. Anthony found a narrow gap behind the old shed. They stayed low, following the line of a collapsed fence, fighting both fire and smoke. My father stumbled on cracked ground. Anthony hauled him up before he could fall into the glowing embers. At last, they burst out of the smoke. I ran to my father and held him. He coughed hard, face black with ash, but he was alive. I looked at Anthony. For the first time in my life, I did not know what to call him, the enemy of my father, the man who had just saved him, or the father of the woman I loved. I only said, "Thank you." Anthony looked at me, breathing heavily. "Don't thank me yet. Take care of your dad." They took my father to the small hospital in town for smoke inhalation. He had to stay overnight for observation. I sat beside his bed the entire night. The next morning, there was a quiet knock. Anthony walked in. In his hand was the old folded paper, yellowed with age. My father looked at him, voice weak but clear. "I didn't think you'd set foot in here." Anthony pulled a chair close to the bed. He stared at the paper in his hands and his fingers trembled. "Last night, here in the hospital, I finally read all of it." My father frowned. "Read what?" Anthony held the paper out. "Martha wrote it the morning of the fire." My father opened it. I stood beside the bed and watched his hands shake as he read. Anthony's voice came out rough. "It's enough, John. Our children deserve to inherit land, not our anger." My father looked at him. Anthony went on. "For 20 years I believed you chose to save me and left Martha behind." The air in the room grew thick. My father closed his eyes as if the old wound had been struck again. "Anthony, did you really think I could choose like that?" Anthony covered his face with one hand. "I did. Because if I didn't, I wouldn't have had to accept that she died and there was no one left to blame. I couldn't bear that." My father spoke slowly, each word dragged through ash. "I went into the fire because I heard you calling. I pulled you out. Then I went back for Martha, but she was no longer where people said they had last seen her." Anthony looked at the paper. Because she went back. My father raised his head. Anthony's eyes filled. In the letter, she wrote that if anything happened, she could not leave the horses in the old barn. She loved them like children. That day, when everyone thought she had run east, she turned around to save the horses. You didn't leave her. You didn't choose me over her. She went back on her own. My father set the paper down. Both men were silent. The truth after 20 years did not make anything light right away. It only took away the excuse they had used to keep the hatred alive. There had been no betrayal, no cruel choice. Only a tragedy, a brave woman, and two men too broken to look straight at what had really happened. My father covered his eyes. God. Anthony stood. He stepped closer to the bed, hesitated a few seconds, then held out his hand. My father looked at that hand. In that moment, I did not see the man who had hated Anthony Walker for 2 decades. I saw the young man who had lost his closest friend on the same day he lost a piece of his own soul. He took Anthony's hand. Two men near 60 years old cried like brothers who had finally found the road home. I stood outside the room with Sarah. She had come with her father. Neither of us spoke. She simply took my hand and I held on. Our prayers had not been answered the easy way. They had passed through fire, smoke, a hospital room, and an old sheet of paper. But they had been answered. 2 days later, my father was released. When the truck reached Bennett Ridge, he told me to stop at the southern fence. The fence had stood there my entire life. To me, it had been part of the landscape. To him, it had been the border of his pain. He climbed down slowly, still coughing a little from the smoke. From the other side, Anthony's truck pulled up. Sarah sat beside him. The four of us faced each other across the wire. No one spoke for several seconds. Then my father took the wire cutters from his belt. He cut the first strand. The metal snapped loud in the open pasture. He cut the second. Then the third. Anthony stepped forward and pulled a rotten post from the ground. My father helped him. Together they lifted the post free and let it fall. My father looked at Anthony. This fence stopped dividing land a long time ago. It started dividing our lives. Anthony nodded, eyes red. Then today we end it. Hands from both ranches began to gather. No one clapped. No one cheered. But more than a few men wiped their eyes. I looked at the open path that now stretched between Bennett Ridge and Walker Creek, and my throat tightened. All my life, the other side of that fence had been forbidden ground. Now Sarah stepped across first. She stood in front of me, eyes still wet. I said quietly, "This time you don't need a runaway cow for a reason." She laughed through the tears. "Good, I'm out of volunteer cattle." It was the first time I held her hand with no wire between us. The weeks after the fire were the strangest of my life. Nothing became normal overnight. 20 years of hate do not vanish with one handshake. My father and Anthony still fell into long silences when they stood side by side. There were stories they wanted to tell but did not know how to begin. There were old memories that were both beautiful and painful, making both men turn away for a moment. The difference was that they no longer walked off. They stayed inside the discomfort. Sometimes that is the first real step toward forgiveness. Hands from both ranches worked together to repair the burned pasture. Men from Bennett Ridge brought tractors over to Walker Creek. Men from Walker Creek brought water trucks over to Bennett Ridge. People who used to avoid each other's eyes at the grocery store now stood along the same new fence line, passing hammers, pulling wire, and sharing water. One afternoon I saw my father and Anthony standing together at the edge of the ground that was being reseeded. The wind moved across the blackened field, carrying the smell of fresh earth. My father said, "You know what I regret most?" Anthony asked, "What?" "I let a tragedy become bigger than our friendship." Anthony looked down. "I regret that I never let you speak." My father gave a tired smile. "I gave up too soon myself." Anthony gazed toward the horizon. "Martha would have scolded us until we couldn't sleep." My father actually laughed. "Rose would have done the same." It was the first time I heard my father speak both women's names in the same breath without the pain forcing him to stop. Around the same time, the two ranches began to work together in other ways. Walker Creek had experience with apples, honey, and selling direct to local people. Bennett Ridge had good milk and a plan for a small cheese room. Sarah suggested a weekend market right on the new path between the two places. I added the idea of simple tours for families from Red Hollow. Children could watch milking, pick apples, learn about bees, taste cheese, and buy what the land produced. My father frowned at first. Visitors will make a mess of the yard. Anthony answered, John, your cows make a bigger mess than any visitors. My father looked at him for a second. Then both men laughed. Sarah and I glanced at each other, almost unable to believe it. Two men who once could not stand in the same festival were now arguing about where to put the cheese and honey stalls. The land slowly came back. Green shoots appeared in the burned pasture. The cheese room at Bennett Ridge was repaired. The apple trees at Walker Creek blossomed. The dirt road between the two houses was graded so trucks could pass. The people of Red Hollow changed too. They used to tell the story of the two families' feud like a sad local legend. Now they saw Bennett and Walker trucks parked side by side outside the church. They saw John and Anthony drinking coffee together at the diner. They saw Sarah walk into our house as if she had always been welcome. One Sunday afternoon after church, I asked to speak with my father and Anthony. Sarah stood beside me. Her hand rested in mine, warm and slightly trembling. I drew a breath. I'd like your permission to marry Sarah. Both men were quiet. My heart pounded harder than it had during the fire, the stampeding cattle, or any milk audit I had ever faced. Nothing felt more terrifying than standing in front of two men who had hated each other for 20 years and asking to marry the daughter of one and become the son-in-law of the other. My father looked at Anthony. I think this answer doesn't belong only to me. Anthony stepped closer to Sarah. He took his daughter's hand and then placed it over mine. His eyes were full. For a long time, I thought protecting you meant keeping you away from the Bennetts. He looked at my father, then back at us. Now I understand that protecting means trusting God can write a better story than the one I tried to control. My father put his hand on my shoulder. Son, if you love her the way a man should love, never let pride speak louder than your heart. I promise, I said. He hugged me, then he hugged Sarah. After that, he turned to Anthony and said, Welcome back, brother. Anthony could not answer. He only pulled my father into an embrace. A few months later, our wedding took place in the open field between the two ranches, exactly where the old fence had once stood. There were no separate sides for the groom's family and the bride's family, no Bennetts on one half and Walkers on the other. Hands from both places sat mixed together. People from Red Hollow came in greater numbers than we expected. Children ran across the grass without knowing that the ground under their feet had once been the border of 20 years of hate. Sarah wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked from both ranches. Anthony walked her down the new dirt path. When he placed her hand in mine, he gripped my fingers hard and spoke low enough for only me to hear. Don't ever make her live behind a fence again. I won't, I answered. During the reception, my father asked to speak. He stood in front of everyone, hair a little grayer after the fire, voice still rough but clear. For 20 years, I believed time could heal any wound. I was wrong. Time heals nothing if you keep holding the pain tight. It only teaches you how to live with the wound. He looked at Anthony. What heals people is forgiveness. Anthony stepped up beside him. And the ones who taught us that were our children, because they were brave enough to love when we only knew how to remember. I looked at Sarah. She was crying, but she was also smiling. When the sun went down behind the Montana mountains, I looked toward the place where the old fence had stood. Now there was only a simple dirt road connecting Bennett Ridge and Walker Creek. It was not wide, it was not beautiful, but it was enough for people to walk across. To me, that road was the clearest image of the whole story. Hate can raise a fence for 20 years. Pride can turn two good men into prisoners of the past. But if one person is brave enough to step forward, if one person is broken enough to speak the truth, if one person loves enough to pray for a father's heart instead of only asking to be loved, then the place that once held a fence can still become a road. I used to think the greatest victory in this story was marrying Sarah. I was wrong. The greatest victory was watching my father and Anthony sit side by side at the wedding, laughing like two friends who had finally found the youth they had lost. Sarah rested her head on my shoulder as the evening grew quiet. She asked, "Do you think our mothers can see this?" I looked at the dirt road between the two ranches where the last light of day lay across it like a quiet blessing. I think they waited for this day longer than we did. And for the first time in my life, I looked toward Walker Creek and saw no border. I only saw home,